The purpose of this podcast is to educate and inform. It is no substitute for professional care by your doctor or your qualified healthcare professional. Never disregard or delay professional medical advice because of something you've heard on this podcast or in any linked material. Guests who speak on this podcast express their own opinions, experience, and conclusions. Dr. Shirley neither endorses nor opposes any particular opinion discussed on this podcast. The views expressed on this podcast have no relation to those of any academic, hospital, practice, institution, or other entity with which Dr. Shirley may be affiliated.
Welcome to Forever Fab, the podcast on fashion, the art of living, and all things beauty. This podcast is curated by Dr. Shirley Madhere, MD, as the definitive source of holistic wellness through beauty.
Welcome to Forever Fab, the podcast dedicated to fashion, the art of living well, and all things beauty. I'm your host, Dr. Shirley Madhere, your purveyor of this definitive source of living a beautiful life. This week's episode is dedicated to resilience and perseverance. And this week's topic will explore what it means to live a truly beautiful life. In fact, it's a topic for all the ages and, in my opinion, for all of time. Where do I begin? Yes, I know. I'll begin here. George Floyd, Jamar Clark, Philando Castile, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Alton Sterling, Freddie Gray, Ralph Bell, Michael Brown, Laquan Martin, Brian Quinones, Walter Scott, Trayvon Martin, John Crawford III, Stephen DeMarco Taylor, Terrence Franklin, Stephon Clark, Antoine Rose, Sean Reed, Ariane McCree, Darius Tarver, Devon Bailey, Larry Jackson Jr., Nakia Moody, Alfred Abuka Sanders, Fue Lee, Cordell Handy, Phil Quinn, Ezell Ford, Dante Parker, Tysel Nelson, George Mann, Akai Gurley, Michelle Cousseau, Tanisha Anderson, Rumaine Brisbane, Matthew Ajibade, Isaac Aiden, Fong Lee, Jeremy Reed, Frank Smart, Natasha McKenna, Anthony Hill, David McAtee. And this is only a partial list of those who died at the hands of injustice. There are so many who, though still living, are suffocating. You know, biologically, the mechanisms that allow us as humans to breathe air, or to breathe, simply breathe, are the same for everyone. Lungs, cells, blood flow, connective tissue, etc. Yet some of us are still denied air. My first recollection of the systemic assault, the other virus, was that of me as a child and my mother in a high-end fashion store in a neighborhood where we did not live and perhaps likely where we were not welcomed. But that didn't matter because I was raised to know that I belong anywhere and everywhere. Nevertheless, after a brief interaction with a Caucasian woman, the feeling that I was left with after hearing her condescending comment against me has stayed with me to this day. And throughout the years that followed, there came more. Being told by others that I'm not good enough. Being called a, quote, cute little monkey by an ex-boyfriend's mother. Being ridiculed in front of colleagues for answering a question differently, even though it was not, in fact, the wrong answer. Getting reprimanded by a supervisor minutes before I had to take a qualifying national exam. Asking for help and advice, earnestly, only to receive erroneous, faulty, and failing advice from a colleague. Reporting verbal and emotional abuse, but being warned of professional blackballing if I proceeded with action. Reporting a stalker, but having my behaviors questioned and examined instead of the perpetrator. The undermining, the mind tricks, the sabotage, the subterfuge, the rejections, the omissions, the denials, the words, the actions, the energy. There are so many stories I could tell, all too familiar to me and other people of color, but perhaps unknown to you. At least I'm still alive to tell those stories. But I don't want to dwell on my past stories. I want us all to move forward and upward with progress, and maybe even with love. So to the transgressors and aggressors and the perpetrators of the macro and the micro aggressions, you know who you are. I forgive you, but I will never forget. And I am sure you will never forget me. I have released the pain of my past, but have not released you from your obligation to do better, act better, and be better now and for future generations. This is an opening to a much larger discussion of a much broader scope. I invite you to examine your thoughts and intentions and contemplate these questions. So in the usual Forever Fab podcast manner, I direct these questions to you. Who are you, really? What are you afraid of? What is your truth? Are you willing to sacrifice your truth for freedom for all? What do you stand for? What do you stand against? Whom do you stand against? Tell me who your friends are, and I'll tell you who you are. So who are your allies and advocates? And how did you invite them into your life? Do you believe that you should treat others as you would have others treat you? What are you devoted to? What side of history will you co-sign? Is your indoctrination your identity, and therefore are you caught up in a collective identity crisis? What are you truly seeking on a soul level? Are your values in alignment with what you are seeking? Do your beliefs tether you to your perceived limitations? Have your actions and behaviors shackled you to a societally made construct? Are you evolving into the most radically loving, highest self that you can be? Or are you confined to some fixed, albeit false, notion of being better than someone? In all of your observations throughout life, have you ever turned your lens around to take a good, long, examining look at yourself? Do you expect us to sacrifice our freedom for your approval? Would you give up your freedom for my approval? And lastly, really, what can you do to ensure a more beautiful life for others? In summary, positive change must come. Evolution of our species must progress. We must be aligned with higher, loving values. The isms must be abolished, all of them. As such, here are my calls to action to help you to live a truly beautiful life. Above all, become aware, acknowledge the truths, reflect on your complicity, have the difficult conversations, support businesses of color, invite creators of color into the room and to sit at the table and to contribute. Confront the wrongs and act to make them right, and don't be afraid to do it. And to the freedom fighters, do not stop and do not be afraid. In the words of Shaman Durek, you matter because you are. Your presence and your purpose and your breath are sacred. You are worthy and you matter. As always, If you like this episode of the Forever Fab podcast, please share it and subscribe to the feed. And that's all for now. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Forever Fab podcast. Until next time, stay beautiful and fearless inside and out.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Forever Fab, the podcast on fashion, the art of living, and all things beauty, curated by Dr. Shirley Madhere, MD. Live beautifully and help make the world a more beautiful place.